Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak has been sworn in as Prime Minister, succeeding fellow Conservative Party member Liz Truss, who resigned her post after just 6 weeks on the job. Sunak was a supporter of Brexit, Britain's narrowly approved 2016 referendum on whether to exit the European Union. He comes from one of the nation's wealthiest families, with a net worth estimated at more than $800 million. He was the wealthiest member of the House of Commons. Sunak becomes Britain's first ever Prime Minister of colour and third Prime Minister in 50 days after Boris Johnson resigned amidst a series of scandals. Rishi Sunak delivered his first address as Prime Minister from 10 Downing Street earlier today.
I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come.
Rishi Sunak was a Goldman Sachs banker. Across the UK, calls are growing for a general election. The leader of Scotland's National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, said Monday the turmoil in the Conservative or Tory party showed the need for greater Scottish independence.
It's going to be the fifth Prime Minister in the years that I've been First Minister. Now, I'm only saying that to illustrate the instability and the uncertainty and the chaos that the Tories have unleashed on all of us. They have no mandate. And, you know, it is a democratic necessity that people get their say on who occupies number 10 Downing Street.
Representatives from Ethiopia's government and rebel forces in Tigray gathered in South Africa Monday for peace talks mediated by the African Union. The talks came as the United Nations warned the situation in Ethiopia is spiraling out of control, with reports of widespread atrocities, including airstrikes and artillery fire that have exacerbated a humanitarian catastrophe. Some estimates put the number of dead in Tigray at 800,000 since fighting erupted less than 2 years ago. The UN says the resulting health crisis now threatens 6 million people. The UN's International Atomic Energy Agency says it will send inspectors to 2 Ukrainian nuclear sites after Russia claimed without evidence that Ukraine was preparing to deploy a radioactive device known as a dirty bomb against Russia. Ukraine has rejected the charge and plans to bring up the issue at the UN Security Council when it meets today. Meanwhile, Germany's president has arrived in Kyiv on his first visit to Ukraine since Russia invaded in February. President Frank-Walter Steinmeier's trip comes 2 days after Germany's ministers of defense and foreign affairs called for a dramatic boost in German and European Union aid to Ukraine's military. Here in the United States, a group of 30 progressive Congress members is calling on President Biden to pursue direct negotiations with Russia. In a letter sent Monday to President Biden, the 30 lawmakers, led by Congressional Progressive Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal, write, quote, "We urge you to pair the military and economic support the United States has provided to Ukraine with a proactive diplomatic push, redoubling efforts to seek a realistic framework for a ceasefire," unquote. The letter goes on to state, the alternative to diplomacy is protracted war, with both its attendant certainties and catastrophic and unknowable risks, unquote. A Russian court's hearing an appeal today by WNBA basketball star Brittany Griner, sentenced in August to 9 years in a Russian penal colony after she pleaded guilty to carrying a small amount of marijuana oil into Russia. A ruling is expected later Tuesday. Griner was arrested at the Moscow airport in February when customs officials found vape cartridges containing a small amount of cannabis oil in her luggage. In Missouri, a teenage gunman shot and killed a teacher and student at the Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in South St. Louis on Monday. 4 other students were shot and wounded before the gunman was shot dead by police. Police identified him as a 19-year-old recent graduate of the school. He was armed with a long gun and more than a dozen 30-round magazines. Witnesses say many more people could have died if the gunman's gun had not jammed during the assault.
I was trying to run, and I couldn't run. And me and him made eye contact, and I'm glad I made it out because his gun got jammed. But we saw blood on the floor. I think somebody got shot.
In Michigan, a teenage gunman pleaded guilty on Monday to charges of first-degree murder and terrorism for a mass shooting at Oxford High School in a Detroit suburb last November. Ethan Crumbley was just 15 years old at the time of the attack, which killed 4 students and injured 6 other people. Crumbley may be called to testify against his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, who face manslaughter charges for allegedly giving the gun used in the shooting to their son as an early Christmas present, and for failing to intervene when their son showed clear signs of mental distress ahead of the massacre. In Florida, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis faced off against Democratic challenger Charlie Crist Monday for their first and only debate ahead of November's election. DeSantis refused to say whether he would serve a full 4-year term if reelected in November, adding to speculation he'll compete for the Republican Party's presidential nomination. Meanwhile, Charlie Crist blasted DeSantis over his anti-scientific views on gender, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Ron, I wouldn't pat yourself on the back too much about your response to COVID. We've lost 82,000 of our fellow Floridians. And when you look at the Thanksgiving table, one of those empty seats is probably one of those people for many families watching tonight. And if we had only had the standard of other states in the United States, 40,000 of those people would still be alive, enough to fill Tropicana Stadium in St. Petersburg. That's tragic.
Charlie Crist served a 4-year term as governor of Florida, beginning in 2007, when he was elected on the Republican ticket. He later switched party affiliations to become a Democrat. In Pennsylvania, Democrat John Fetterman and Republican Mehmet Oz are set to meet this evening for their first and only debate. We'll get the latest on the U.S. midterm elections later in the broadcast. The Supreme Court has put a temporary hold on a judge's order that would require South Carolina Republican Senator Lindsey Graham to appear before a Georgia grand jury to answer questions about his efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. On Monday, Justice Clarence Thomas granted Senator Graham's emergency request to put the subpoena on hold temporarily while Graham's lawyers pushed to have it quashed permanently. Democrats have demanded Justice Thomas recuse himself from cases related to the 2020 election because his wife, Ginny Thomas, spread false claims about a stolen election and lobbied federal and state officials to overturn the election results. Supreme Court rules obligate justices to withdraw themselves from cases where there's even the appearance of a conflict of interest. In Minnesota, former Minneapolis police officer J. Alexander King accepted a deal Monday that will see him plead guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter in the killing of George Floyd in May 2020. In exchange, state prosecutors agreed to drop a murder charge against King, who faces a likely 42-month prison term at a future sentencing hearing. On Monday, another former officer, Tu Tao, waived his right to have a jury decide his fate and will instead have a judge weigh existing evidence against him in a stipulated bench trial. Tao and King are already serving federal prison terms after they were convicted of depriving George Floyd of his constitutional rights. In the West Bank, at least 6 Palestinians were killed and nearly 24 others injured following raids by Israeli forces early Tuesday morning. Al Jazeera reports one of the victims, Qusay al-Tamimi, was 19 years old and lived in the village of Nabi Salah near the city of Ramallah. In related news, Amnesty International is calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate possible war crimes committed by Israel during its latest deadly assault on the Gaza Strip in August. Among those killed by Israeli forces were a 4-year-old child and a teenager who was visiting her mother's grave, according to a new Amnesty report published Tuesday. Agnes Kayamard, Amnesty International Secretary General said in a statement, quote, Israel's latest offensive on Gaza lasted only 3 days, but that was ample time to unleash fresh trauma and destruction on the besieged population. The 3 deadly attacks we examined must be investigated as war crimes. All victims of unlawful attacks and their families deserve justice and reparations, Calamard said. In Iran, over 300 people have been indicted on criminal charges for participating in the massive protests that have rocked the streets of Tehran and other cities in Iran for more than a month. At least 4 of them were charged as enemies of God, an offense that can carry the death penalty, according to Iranian officials. Despite the brutal crackdown, demonstrations continue in Tehran, sparked by the September 16th death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini while in custody of the so-called morality police. On Monday, Iranian security forces fired tear gas at a girls' high school. A clash between school staff and students reportedly broke out after the school's principal insisted on checking the students' cell phones. In Bangladesh, at least 16 people are dead and some 10 million left without power after a cyclone triggered torrential rains, heavy winds, and flooding in the capital Dhaka and across other parts of the country. Cyclone Sitrang made landfall in the coastal regions of southern and southwestern Bangladesh late Monday, destroying homes and cutting off telecommunication lines. About 1 million people were evacuated. This comes as scientists warn climate change is likely making cyclones more intense and frequent. North and South Korea exchanged warning shots in waters off the west coast of the Korean peninsula Monday after South Korea's military accused a North Korean merchant vessel of crossing a maritime boundary. The exchange of artillery fire came after South Korean forces joined the USS Ronald Reagan carrier battle group for U.S.-led war games of the Korean peninsula. It follows a record pace of weapons tests carried out by North Korea this year. On Monday, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol promised a strong military response to what he said were plans by North Korea to carry out its first nuclear weapons test in more than 5 years.
Not only has it openly announced its intention to preemptively use nuclear weapons, it appears that preparations for a 7th nuclear test have already been completed. We will strengthen our deterrence against North Korea with overwhelming capabilities through the combined defense posture of South Korea and the United States, as well as security cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Japan, so that our people can live their daily lives with confidence.
Back in the United States, public health experts are warning cases of respiratory syncytial virus, or RSV, are skyrocketing among children, overwhelming hospitals nationwide as many are near or at capacity. RSV starts with mild cold symptoms, can lead to pneumonia and bronchiolitis, and very young children can be life-threatening in infants and young adults. And Penn State University canceled a speaking event Monday night with Gavin McGinnis, founder of the far-right group the Proud Boys, following massive backlash and student-led protests. The event was sponsored by the right-wing student organization Uncensored America and also featured right-wing Blaze TV host Alex Stein. Penn State officials accused peaceful protesters of obstruction and censorship, but then claimed to not support McGinnis and Stein's views. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. When we come back, we look at China as Xi Jinping begins a historic 3rd term as head of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll look at what 5 more years of Xi means for China and U.S.-China relations.